Imagine spending your whole life trying to earn something that was already given to you the moment you were born. Imagine working, striving, performing, proving yourself worthy every single day, when the thing you were chasing had already been placed in your hands before you ever took your first step. That is exactly what is happening to millions of people who read Ephesians 2:8 and completely miss what the Greek is actually saying. They read the English word grace and they nod, they underline it, they even preach on it, and yet they walk away from that verse still trying to earn what the verse says cannot be earned. There is a single verb tense hidden in the Greek of this passage that most translations flatten out, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It changes whether you think of salvation as something happening to you right now, in process, still uncertain, or as something already finished, already sealed, already complete. Paul did not choose that tense by accident. He chose the one Greek form that makes the boldest possible claim a first-century writer could make about the human condition. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this one sentence, only 12 words in the original language, was considered so dangerous and so liberating that entire religious systems were built to soften it. Let us take this apart, piece by piece, slowly, carefully, because the surface reading of this verse and the reading the Greek actually demands are further apart than almost anyone realizes. Before we touch the Greek, you need to understand where this sentence sits. Ephesians is a letter with a very deliberate architecture. The first 3 chapters are pure doctrine, no commands, no instructions, nothing about how to live. Paul spends 3 chapters simply describing what God has already done. He talks about being chosen before the foundation of the world. He talks about being dead in trespasses and sins. He talks about being made alive together with Christ. Only after 3 chapters of pure declaration does Paul switch, in chapter 4, to instruction. He says, therefore, walk in a manner worthy of the calling. Notice the order. Identity first, behavior second, position first, practice second. This is not a small detail. It is the entire argument of the letter compressed into its structure. And right in the middle of those 3 doctrinal chapters sits the sentence that summarizes everything that came before it and sets up everything that comes after it. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. 4 clauses. Grace, faith, not your own doing, not of works. Every single clause is doing something specific in the Greek that the English smooths over. Start with the word grace itself. In English, grace has become almost a religious decoration, a nice word we attach to prayers and hymns. But the Greek word Paul uses is charis, and in the culture Paul was writing into, charis had a very specific and very loaded meaning. It described a favor given by someone with power to someone without power, a favor that could never be repaid, a favor that created a relationship of dependence rather than a transaction of equals. In the patronage systems of the ancient Mediterranean world, a wealthy patron might grant charis to someone lower in status, and everyone understood the rules. You could never pay a patron back in equal measure. You could only respond with loyalty, with honor, with gratitude. The gift itself was never in question, it was already given. The only open question was how you would respond to it. When Paul takes this word and applies it to God, he is making a claim that would have stunned his original readers. He is saying that God has acted like the ultimate patron, granting an unearned, unrepayable favor, and that the entire relationship between God and humanity now operates on this logic instead of the logic of merit. This is not a minor connotation. This is the whole architecture of the sentence. Now here is where it gets sharper. The word translated "you have been saved" is one Greek verb, sisos menoi, and this is the detail almost no English translation preserves clearly. Sisos menoi is a perfect passive participle. Every part of that grammatical label matters. Perfect tense in Greek does not simply mean past tense. Greek has a separate past tense, the aorist, for describing a completed action in the past with no comment on its ongoing relevance. The perfect tense is different. The perfect tense describes an action that was completed in the past and whose results continue into the present with full force. When Paul wanted to say simply, "you were saved" as a past event, he had a tense available for that. He deliberately chose the one tense that says something much stronger. He is saying you were saved, and that salvation is a present, ongoing, continuing reality right now, at this very moment, as you read this sentence. It is not you are being saved, as if it is a process still underway with an uncertain outcome. It is not you were saved, as a bare historical fact disconnected from your current state. It is you have been saved, and you remain in a saved condition. The action is finished. The result is permanent. And then Paul adds passive voice on top of that. Passive voice means the subject of the sentence did not perform the action. The subject received the action from someone else. You did not save yourself. Something was done to you by someone else, and you are the recipient standing inside the finished result of that action. Stack these two grammatical facts on top of each other and you get something remarkable. Sesos menoi is not describing a project you are working on. It is describing a status you already occupy. Think about how differently you would live if you stopped treating your salvation like an application still under review and started treating it like a verdict already delivered. Most people who call themselves people of faith are quietly, functionally living as if their standing before God updates daily based on their performance. A good day of prayer and obedience nudges the needle up. A bad day of sin and failure nudges the needle down. But that entire mental model contradicts the very verb Paul chose. Sesos menoi does not fluctuate. It is not a needle. It is a completed, passive, ongoing state, granted by someone else resting on ground that does not shift when your behavior shifts. But Paul is not finished, and this is where the passage becomes almost aggressive in how far it pushes the point. He continues, "And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God." In the Greek, the phrase is kai tuto ok ex himon, theo to doron. The word tuto, translated this, is a neuter demonstrative pronoun, and this single grammatical detail has caused more theological debate than almost any other word in the New Testament. Here is why it matters. The nearest noun before tuto is faith, pistis, and pistis in Greek is feminine. If Paul meant to say specifically that faith itself is the gift of God, grammatical agreement would normally call for a feminine pronoun to match faith. Instead, Paul uses the neuter tuto, this thing which grammatically points backward not to one specific noun, but to the entire preceding concept, the whole reality of grace plus salvation plus faith taken together as a single unit. Paul is saying this whole situation, this entire arrangement of being saved by grace through faith, all of it is gift, not earned, not generated, not achieved, given. And then he closes the loop even tighter with the next phrase, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. The Greek word for works is ergon, and uk ex ergon literally means not out of works, not sourced from works, not originating in works. Paul is not simply saying that works are insufficient or that works alone cannot save you. He is saying that the entire salvation event, from beginning to end, does not have works as its point of origin. Works are not even partially the source. And then he gives the reason, hina metis kauchasetai, so that no one may boast. The Greek word kauchaomai means to boast, to glory in, to take pride in something as your own achievement. Paul is saying that if any part of salvation originated in human effort, even a small part, there would be room for a person to stand before God and claim partial credit. The entire design of the sentence is constructed specifically to remove every possible platform a person could stand on, to claim they contributed to their own rescue. Here's the paradox almost nobody sits with long enough to feel its full weight. If salvation is entirely gift, entirely charis, entirely sesos menoi in the perfect passive, entirely tuto pointing to the whole reality as a gift, entirely uk ex ergon with works excluded from the very source of it, then what exactly is left for a human being to do? This is precisely the question Paul anticipates because 2 verses later, in Ephesians 2:10, he writes that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. The Greek word for workmanship is poiema, the word from which we get the English word poem. Paul is calling every person who has received this grace a poiema, a crafted work of art, a masterpiece. And notice the order again, because the order is the entire argument of the letter in miniature. You are not saved by producing good works so that you might become God's masterpiece. You are made God's masterpiece first, and good works flow out of that identity afterward. The works do not create the relationship. The works are supposed to be the natural overflow of a relationship that already exists, already finished, already sealed in the perfect tense. This is the direction almost every reader gets backward, and it is the same reversal we find across the entire New Testament whenever grace and identity are discussed. People instinctively think the sequence runs from effort to acceptance, from proving yourself to being received. Paul flips the sequence completely. Acceptance comes first, complete and unearned. Effort comes after, not as the cause of belonging, but as the evidence and the expression of a belonging that was never in doubt. Think about how this reframes the entire Christian life. It is not a ladder you climb toward God, testing at every rung whether you have done enough to advance. It is a house you already live in, and the good works are simply what naturally happens inside a house someone else built for you and already gave you the keys to. Consider how radical this must have sounded in the first-century world Paul was writing into, a world absolutely saturated with religious systems built entirely around merit, sacrifice, ritual purity, and earning the favor of the gods through correct performance. Paul takes the most common religious assumption of his entire culture, that divine favor must be earned through effort, and detonates it with a single sentence built on a perfect passive verb and a neuter pronoun. He is not offering a slightly easier path to the same old goal of earning approval. He is declaring that the goal itself, earning approval, has been made obsolete, replaced entirely by a gift already given and already sealed. And this reframes the anxious, performance-driven version of faith that so many people quietly carry without even realizing it. If you find yourself constantly measuring whether you have prayed enough, read enough, served enough, repented thoroughly enough to feel secure before God, Ephesians 2:8 is speaking directly into that anxiety. The verb sesos menoi is not asking you to check your performance level today. It is describing a completed, passive, ongoing reality that does not depend on today's performance at all. The measuring itself, the entire mental habit of scorekeeping, is built on a theology the Greek grammar directly contradicts. Here is what makes this the sharpest turn of the whole passage. It is not simply that grace makes salvation easier to obtain. It is that grace relocates the entire source of salvation outside of you completely. Charis, the patron's gift. Sesos menoi, the perfect passive state, done to you, not by you. Tuto, the whole reality as gift, not just a fragment of it. Aukex ergon, works excluded even as a partial origin point. Every single word in this sentence is aimed at the same target, removing every possible claim a human being could make to have contributed to their own rescue, so that the only appropriate posture left is not achievement but response, not calculation but gratitude, not boasting, but the quiet astonishment of someone who realizes they are already standing inside a finished gift. So ask yourself honestly which version of this verse you have actually been living. Have you been treating your standing before God as a project still in process, still uncertain, still dependent on whether today was a good day or a bad day? Or have you been living inside the reality the Greek actually describes, a completed action, a permanent passive state, a masterpiece already crafted, works flowing out of belonging rather than earning it? The verb tense Paul chose was not accidental, and it was not neutral. It was the strongest possible claim the Greek language allowed him to make, that the rescue is finished, that the gift has already been placed in your hands, and that the only remaining question is not whether you have done enough, but whether you will finally stop trying to earn what was never for sale. There is another layer to this that most readers never reach because they stop at Ephesians and never trace the same pattern through the rest of Paul's letters. The same logic Paul builds in Ephesians 2:8 shows up again and again, almost like a fingerprint, whenever he talks about how a person comes to stand right before God. In Romans 4, Paul uses Abraham as his central example, and he makes a point of saying that Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. The Greek word for counted there is logizomai, an accounting term, a term used in ledgers and financial records. Paul is deliberately using the language of bookkeeping to describe something that is the exact opposite of earning. He says explicitly that to the one who works, wages are not counted as a gift but as an obligation, But to the one who does not work but trusts, that trust is counted as righteousness. Notice the same structure again. There is a debt language and a gift language sitting side by side. And Paul is insisting that whatever is happening in salvation belongs entirely to the gift category, and none of it belongs to the wage category. This is not Paul improvising a new idea in Ephesians. It is the same architecture he lays out in Romans and Titus 3:5, where he writes that God saved us, not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy. The phrase "not because of works done by us in righteousness" is almost a direct echo of uk ex ergon from Ephesians. Two different letters, two different audiences, the same insistence, the same refusal to let human effort sit anywhere near the source of salvation. Now return to that word charis for a moment, because there is a detail about its shape in Greek that adds even more weight to what Paul is doing. Charis comes from the same root as the word charizomai, which means to freely forgive, to graciously cancel a debt. When Paul later tells the Ephesians, in chapter 4, to forgive one another, just as God in Christ forgave you, the verb he uses is charizomai, sharing that same root as charis. This is not a coincidence buried in obscure grammar. It is the entire ethical argument of the letter compressed into vocabulary. The same reality that saved you, an unearned, unrepayable gift, is the same reality you are now asked to extend toward other people. You cannot rightly understand Ephesians 2:8 as an isolated verse about personal salvation and stop there, because Paul builds his entire vision of community, forgiveness, and relationships later in the letter directly on top of it. The grace that saves you is the same grace you are meant to become a channel for. Think for a moment about how differently a person behaves depending on which of these two models they actually believe, even if they would never say it out loud. Someone who quietly believes their standing before God is still being calculated, still a project in process, tends to relate to God the way a nervous employee relates to a demanding manager, always slightly on edge, always wondering if this week's performance was good enough, always privately comparing themselves to others to reassure themselves they are still ahead of the curve. But someone who has actually absorbed what sesos menoi means, a completed permanent passive state, tends to relate to God the way a child relates to a parent whose love was never in question, free to fail, free to grow, motivated by gratitude rather than fear. These are not two slightly different flavors of the same faith. They are two entirely different foundations, and only one of them matches the grammar Paul actually wrote. This also explains why Paul places such enormous emphasis on removing every possible ground for boasting. Kauchaomai, that word for boasting, appears constantly throughout Paul's letters, almost as if he is standing guard against a single recurring temptation, the temptation to quietly take partial credit. Notice he does not simply say that boasting is unwise or impolite. He constructs the entire theological architecture of salvation specifically so that boasting becomes structurally impossible. If salvation were even 10% dependent on your effort, there would be a legitimate basis for pride in that 10%. Paul is not interested in shrinking that percentage. He eliminates it. Charis excludes it by definition, sesos menoi excludes it by tense, tuto excludes it by scope, and uk ex ergon excludes it by explicit statement. 4 separate grammatical mechanisms, each one closing a different door that human pride could otherwise walk through. If this changed the way you read Ephesians 2:8, you will never read the word grace the same way again. It looks like a soft, comfortable word on the surface, but underneath it sits one of the most radical grammatical claims in the entire New Testament, a perfect passive verb declaring that the work is already finished and you are already standing inside it. Share this with someone who has been quietly exhausting themselves trying to earn what grace already gave them. Send it to the person who still believes their worth in front of God, rises and falls with how well they performed this week, because the Greek behind this one verse was written specifically to end that exhausting cycle for good. We have gone deep into the tenses hidden inside Paul's letters before, into the single words that unlock entire doctrines, into the structure that reveals what English translations quietly smooth away. Every video connects to the next one. Every thread leads somewhere further into the text, one verb tense at a time, one small Greek word unlocking a doctrine that changes how an entire life is lived. Charis, the unearned gift. Sesos menoi, the finished, permanent, passive state, tuto, the whole reality as gift. Poema, the masterpiece you already are. Not a ladder to climb, a house you already live in, not a debt slowly repaid, a gift already placed in your hands before you ever reached for it. The question was never whether you have done enough. The question was always whether you will finally believe it is already done, and let the gratitude of that finished gift, not the fear of falling short, become the reason you live differently starting today.